Naomi could feel every eye in the room pressing against her skin as she sat beside Elliot Strauss. The crystal chandelier above the conference table reflected against the black marble like broken pieces of light, but nobody spoke. Nobody even touched their drinks anymore. Charles Drake remained standing near the end of the table, frozen between anger and humiliation, while the silence slowly swallowed the room whole. Elliot adjusted the sleeve of his navy suit before sliding a thin manila folder across the table toward Naomi. "I think you deserve to see this," he said quietly. Naomi hesitated before opening it. Inside were printed photographs, old newspaper clippings, and a faded image that immediately made her chest tighten. Her father, younger, smiling, wearing the dark blue mechanic uniform he used to come home in every night. For a second, the room disappeared. She could almost smell engine oil and summer rain again. Almost hear his laugh coming through the tiny apartment kitchen back in Oakland. Naomi stared at the photo with trembling fingers. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Elliot's expression softened in a way powerful men rarely allowed. "Your father saved my life 23 years ago." The room shifted instantly. Charles blinked in confusion while several investors exchanged startled looks. Elliot leaned back slowly, his voice lower now, heavier. "I was not always a billionaire. Back then I was just another reckless businessman trying to build something bigger than myself. One night outside Sacramento, my car spun off Highway 50 during a storm." Naomi looked up carefully, her heartbeat growing louder. "The police report said the vehicle caught fire after impact. They said nobody should have survived." Elliot nodded once. "Your father pulled me out before emergency crews arrived. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He stayed with me in the rain for almost 40 minutes until help came." Elliot glanced toward the photo in Naomi's hands. "I never forgot his face." Naomi swallowed hard. She remembered that storm. She remembered her father coming home soaked to the bone with blood on his shirt that was not his own. He never explained much, just smiled tiredly and told her that helping people was what decent men were supposed to do. Elliot folded his hands together. "A year later, I tried to find him again, but by then he was gone." Naomi lowered her eyes. Her father had died from heart failure when she was 16. No insurance, no savings, just debt and silence. Elliot's voice became rough around the edges. "I spent 2 decades building companies while carrying a debt I could never repay." Then he looked directly at Naomi. "Until tonight." Across the room, Charles Drake finally understood the disaster unfolding in front of him. The woman he insulted was not invisible. She was the daughter of the man who once saved the most powerful investor in California. And now every person at that table was beginning to look at Naomi Ellis very differently. The wind moved softly through the cemetery trees, carrying the smell of wet grass and cold stone across the hillside as Naomi stood frozen beside her father's grave. Jonathan Hale remained silent for a long moment after his confession, his black umbrella lowered slightly against the gray California sky. Around them, the 10 men in dark suits still knelt quietly, heads bowed, hands folded like they were standing inside a church instead of a cemetery. Naomi looked from face to face, confused by the emotion written across strangers she had never met before. One man wiped tears from his eyes. Another stared down at the soil with trembling lips. None of them looked powerful now. They looked grateful. Jonathan finally reached inside his coat and removed a worn leather notebook. The edges were faded from age, the corners softened by years of handling. He held it carefully before offering it to Naomi with both hands. "Your father gave me this the night he saved me," he said quietly. Naomi hesitated before taking it. The leather felt cold against her fingers. She opened the cover slowly and immediately recognized her father's handwriting. Strong, careful, steady. Her chest tightened so suddenly she almost forgot to breathe. Inside were names, dates, small notes written beside each one. Single mother needs winter tires. Veteran cannot afford medication. Teenager needs work boots for interview. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Jonathan watched her carefully. "Your father kept track of every person he helped," he explained. "Not because he wanted praise, because he wanted to remember people." Naomi swallowed hard as another memory surfaced. Her father sitting at the kitchen table late at night writing in that same notebook while bills piled beside him unopened. She used to think he was balancing money they never had. But now she understood. He was tracking kindness instead. Jonathan pointed toward the men kneeling nearby. Every person here is connected to one of those names. Naomi looked up slowly. A gray-haired man near the front stood first. His expensive suit could not hide the roughness in his hands. "Your father bought me steel-toe boots in 1998, he said, voice breaking. "I was sleeping in my truck outside Fresno. I became a contractor because of him." Another man stepped forward. "My daughter is alive because your father paid for her asthma medication one winter when I could not." Then another, and another. Stories poured into the cold morning air one by one, like confessions. Small acts, forgotten moments, tiny kindnesses Naomi never knew existed. Jonathan's eyes grew distant as he stared at the gravestone. "When your father saved my life, he told me something I never forgot." He paused carefully. "He said money means nothing if it only saves you." Naomi lowered her eyes as tears blurred the carved letters of her father's name. All these years she believed he died exhausted, overlooked, invisible to the world. But standing there among strangers whose lives carried pieces of him forward, Naomi finally realized something powerful. Her father had never been buried in silence. He had been living inside other people all along. Naomi stared at the envelope in her trembling hands while the cemetery fell completely silent around her. Even the wind seemed softer now, like the world itself was waiting for her to open it. The paper looked old, slightly yellow around the edges, the kind of envelope that had survived years hidden away somewhere important. Across the front, written in her father's careful handwriting, were just 4 words. "For my little girl." Naomi pressed her lips together as emotion climbed into her throat so fast it almost hurt. Jonathan Hale stepped back quietly, giving her space while the men behind him lowered their eyes respectfully. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted the moment. Naomi slid one finger beneath the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The paper shook in her hands as she began to read. "Naomi, if you are reading this, then life probably got harder than I wanted for you." Tears blurred the words instantly. She could hear her father's voice inside every sentence. "Calm, warm, steady. I know I will not leave you money. I know I will not leave you a house on a hill or fancy cars or a perfect future. But I hope I leave you something better. I hope I leave you proof that kindness matters." Naomi covered her mouth as a tear slipped down her cheek. Memories hit her one after another. Her father fixing neighbors' cars for free, bringing home extra groceries for families struggling nearby, giving away his winter coat one December and pretending he was not cold afterward. Back then she used to get angry at him for helping strangers when they barely had enough themselves. Now she understood why he never stopped. Jonathan looked toward the gravestone quietly. "He gave away things most rich people never do," he said softly. "Time, dignity, attention." Naomi kept reading. "If somebody ever comes back trying to repay me, promise me something. Do not use it just for yourself. Use it to help somebody who feels forgotten." The cemetery blurred behind tears now. Naomi lowered the letter slowly, her chest aching with a strange mixture of grief and pride she had never felt before. One of the men stepped forward holding a small metal box. He opened it carefully, revealing dozens of photographs inside. Naomi picked one up, her father standing beside a teenage boy holding new work boots. Another showed him outside a church kitchen handing out meals. Another showed him laughing beside Jonathan years before either of them had gray hair. "He never told anyone what he was doing," Jonathan said. "That is why it mattered." Then Jonathan reached into his coat one final time and handed Naomi a thick set of documents. "The Hale Foundation is opening a national outreach program in your father's name," he explained quietly. Naomi looked at him in shock. Jonathan's eyes softened. "And if you are willing," he said carefully, "I want you to lead it." Naomi looked down at the letter again while cold morning light touched the gravestone beside her. For the first time since her father died, she no longer felt like the daughter of a poor forgotten mechanic. She felt like the daughter of a man whose kindness had outlived him. Why would 10 grown men kneel in front of a poor mechanic's grave? The question froze inside Naomi Carter's chest the moment she stepped through the cemetery gates just after sunrise. The cold Oakland air wrapped around her thin waitress uniform, while damp fog rolled low across the grass, like smoke drifting through the dead. In her trembling hands was a $5 bouquet of supermarket carnations tied together with faded ribbon. It was all she could afford this month. Her overnight shift at the diner had barely covered rent, bus fare, and the electricity bill sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. But no matter how exhausted she was, Naomi never missed the anniversary of her father's death. Not once in 11 years. Her shoes crunched softly against wet gravel as she walked deeper into the cemetery, passing rows of quiet headstones still glistening from the morning mist. Then she saw them. 10 men in black suits kneeling silently around her father's grave. Naomi stopped so suddenly the flowers almost slipped from her fingers. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at her. The men remained perfectly still, heads lowered, hands folded in front of them like soldiers honoring someone far greater than themselves. One of them looked old enough to be a retired judge. Another wore a military pin on his dark coat. A third wiped tears from his face with shaking fingers. Naomi's heartbeat began pounding harder with every step. She knew every inch of this cemetery. Her father was buried in the cheapest section near the back fence beside cracked stones and overgrown weeds. Nobody important came here. Nobody wealthy. Nobody powerful. Her father had died exactly the way he lived. Quiet. Broke. Forgotten. At least that was what Naomi believed all these years. A sharp gust of wind swept across the hill, just as the sound of tires rolling over gravel echoed through the cemetery. Slowly, a black Rolls-Royce appeared between the rows of headstones like something from another world. The car stopped beside the grave. Every kneeling man stood immediately. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. The rear door opened, and a tall white man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat and polished black gloves. Even before she saw his face clearly, she recognized him. Jonathan Hale, billionaire founder of Hale Technologies, one of the richest men in California. Naomi had seen him on magazine covers sitting beside presidents and celebrities. Men like him did not belong in places like this. Not beside graves forgotten by the world. Jonathan removed his gloves slowly before walking toward the headstone through the cold morning fog. Then something impossible happened. The billionaire lowered himself onto one knee in the wet grass and bowed his head before her father's grave. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as Jonathan whispered words she would never forget for the rest of her life. "I came back because I owe your father everything." Naomi sat quietly in the back seat of the black Rolls-Royce as rain began tapping softly against the windows during the drive out of the cemetery. The leather seats smelled expensive, warm, untouched by the kind of exhaustion she carried home every night after double shifts at the diner. Across from her, Jonathan Hale remained silent for most of the ride, staring out at the gray streets of Oakland with the expression of a man carrying memories heavier than money. Naomi still held her father's letter tightly against her chest like she was afraid the words might disappear if she let go. Her eyes kept drifting toward the leather notebook resting beside her. The names inside it no longer looked random. They looked like evidence. Proof that her father's kindness had quietly traveled farther than she ever imagined. The car finally slowed in front of a tall glass building downtown. Naomi looked up through the rain-streaked window and immediately recognized the giant silver letters across the front. Hale Foundation Headquarters. Her stomach tightened. "Why are we here?" she asked softly. Jonathan gave a small tired smile. "Because there is something you still need to see." Inside, the lobby glowed with soft golden lights reflecting against white marble floors. Employees in business suits moved quickly through the building carrying coffee cups and laptops. But the moment Jonathan entered, everything shifted. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Naomi felt painfully out of place standing there in her diner shoes and faded coat while billion-dollar executives walked past. Then something even stranger happened. A young receptionist behind the front desk suddenly looked at Naomi with wide eyes. "That is her," she whispered. Within seconds, more employees began staring. One woman covered her mouth in shock. Another reached for her phone. Naomi frowned in confusion. Jonathan gently motioned for her to follow him toward a large conference room overlooking San Francisco Bay. The doors opened slowly. Naomi froze. Her father's face filled the giant digital screen at the front of the room. Not one picture. Hundreds. Old photographs rotated slowly across the screen while employees sat silently around the room watching. Her father fixing cars, smiling beside strangers, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, standing in the rain outside shelters. Naomi's chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. Jonathan walked beside her quietly. "Every year," he explained softly, Our company teaches new employees about the man who changed this foundation. Naomi looked at him in disbelief. Jonathan pressed a button on the remote in his hand. The screen changed to a quote written in large white letters against a black background. Success means nothing if nobody rises with you. Naomi's knees nearly gave out. That was her father's sentence. He used to say it while repairing engines in their tiny garage apartment. Jonathan's voice lowered. I built this company using the values your father taught me after he saved my life. The room remained completely silent now. Dozens of executives looked at Naomi with something she had almost never received from wealthy people before. Respect. Then Jonathan turned toward the employees and said words that made Naomi's heart stop completely. Everyone, he said carefully, meet the daughter of the man this company was built to honor. Naomi could not move. The cold morning fog drifted slowly between the gravestones while Jonathan Hale remained kneeling in the wet grass before her father's headstone like a man standing before something sacred. The billionaire's expensive coat darkened from the rain-soaked ground beneath him, but he did not seem to care. Around him, the other men stood silently with lowered heads, their polished shoes sinking slightly into the muddy earth of the cemetery's forgotten corner. Naomi tightened her grip around the cheap bouquet in her hands until the stems bent beneath her fingers. None of this made sense. Her father had spent his entire life fixing engines in a tiny repair shop outside Oakland. He drove a rusted pickup truck with doors that barely closed. Their apartment roof leaked every winter. Some nights he skipped dinner pretending he was not hungry so Naomi could eat instead. Men like Jonathan Hale did not kneel for people like her father. They barely noticed people like him existed. Jonathan finally lifted his eyes toward Naomi, and for the first time she noticed something unexpected there. Not power. Not arrogance. Shame. Deep, quiet shame that looked years old. The billionaire rose slowly from the ground before carefully brushing rainwater from his gloves. You are Naomi Carter, he said softly. It was not a question. Naomi nodded cautiously without taking another step closer. Jonathan looked at the gravestone again before speaking. Your father saved my life on October 17, 1999. Naomi frowned immediately. That date hit her like cold water. She remembered it because it was the same week her father lost his job at the repair garage. The same week their electricity had been shut off for 3 days. Jonathan's voice remained calm, but heavy with memory. I was driving back from Sacramento during a storm. My car spun off Highway 50 and crashed into a ditch. Naomi's heartbeat slowed strangely as pieces of forgotten childhood memories began shifting inside her mind. She remembered her father coming home late one night, soaked from head to toe, his knuckles bruised, his jacket torn near the shoulder. When she asked what happened, he only smiled tiredly and said, "Somebody needed help." Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and removed an old silver watch with a cracked glass face. "This belonged to your father," he said quietly. Naomi's breath caught instantly. She recognized it. Her father carried that watch every single day until the year before he died, when he suddenly claimed he had lost it. Jonathan turned the watch carefully in his hands. "The paramedics gave me this after the accident. Your father stayed beside me in the rain for almost 40 minutes until emergency crews arrived." The billionaire swallowed hard before continuing. "I tried to pay him afterward. He refused every dollar." Naomi stared at the watch with trembling eyes while cold winds swept through the cemetery trees above them. Jonathan looked directly at her now. "Do you know what your father told me before he walked away?" Naomi could not answer. Jonathan's voice cracked slightly for the first time. He said, "If you really want to repay me someday, help somebody nobody notices." The cemetery fell silent again. And standing there in her diner uniform beside a billionaire and 10 grieving strangers, Naomi suddenly realized her father's kindness had never disappeared. It had been quietly growing somewhere beyond her sight for more than 20 years. Naomi barely had time to process the shock before the conference room doors burst open again. A young assistant hurried inside, holding a tablet against her chest, breathing fast like she had run through the entire building. "Sir," she said nervously toward Jonathan Hale. "The video is everywhere." Jonathan frowned slightly. "What video?" The assistant turned the tablet toward him. Naomi stepped closer instinctively and froze the moment she saw the screen. Footage from the cemetery. Someone had recorded everything. The black Rolls Royce arriving through the fog. 10 men kneeling beside her father's grave. Jonathan Hale bowing his head in silence before a forgotten mechanic's headstone. Naomi standing there in her diner uniform holding cheap grocery store flowers while billionaires and executives surrounded her with tears in their eyes. Millions of views already. The numbers climbed by the second. Jonathan exhaled slowly under his breath while the room remained completely silent. Then another notification appeared. News alerts. National media. Social media pages. Mystery woman at Billionaire's cemetery visit identified. The mechanic who changed Silicon Valley. Why is America crying over one grave? Naomi's hands started shaking again. Her entire life, she had learned how to move through rooms unnoticed. At the diner, customers snapped fingers at her without reading her name tag. Men in suits talked over her like she was part of the furniture. Some nights, she felt invisible even walking through her own neighborhood after work. And now somehow the entire country was staring directly at her. Jonathan studied the screen quietly before lowering the tablet onto the conference table. Your father would hate the attention, Naomi whispered softly. Jonathan gave the smallest smile. Probably. Then his expression changed again, more serious now. But maybe people need this story right now. Naomi looked back toward the giant screen displaying photographs of her father helping strangers through the years. The room suddenly felt heavier. Emotional. Real. One of the executives near the window cleared his throat quietly. Sir, he said carefully. Employees downstairs are gathering in the lobby. Jonathan frowned slightly. Why? The man swallowed hard. They want to meet her. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Jonathan motioned gently toward the hallway. Come with me. The elevator ride down felt strangely quiet. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat louder than the soft music playing overhead. When the doors finally opened into the lobby, the sight in front of her nearly stopped her cold. Hundreds of employees filled the massive marble lobby shoulder to shoulder. Secretaries, engineers, janitors, security guards, executives. Some held tissues. Others clutched coffee cups forgotten halfway to their mouths. And then something happened Naomi never expected. One by one, people started clapping. Softly at first, then louder. The sound spread across the entire building like thunder rolling through glass walls and polished floors. Naomi stood frozen as strangers looked at her with admiration instead of pity, respect instead of dismissal. An elderly janitor near the front stepped forward carefully with tears in his eyes. Your daddy paid my rent once in 1994, he whispered. Naomi's breath caught instantly. The man smiled sadly. He never knew I worked here later. More voices followed behind him. More stories. More lives touched quietly by the same man Naomi thought the world had forgotten. And standing there beneath the golden lights of the Billionaire's building, Naomi finally realized something extraordinary. Her father's kindness had become larger than grief itself. Naomi stood frozen beside her father's grave while cold rain gathered quietly along the sleeves of her diner uniform. Jonathan Hale remained only a few feet away, holding the old silver watch carefully in his hand like it belonged inside a museum instead of a forgotten cemetery. Around them, the men in black suits stayed silent beneath the gray California sky, their expensive umbrellas lowered respectfully toward the ground. Naomi could barely hear the wind anymore. Her mind was too loud now, too full of memories she had not touched in years. She remembered her father coming home exhausted after 14-hour shifts, smelling like motor oil and rainwater. She remembered overdue bills stacked beside the microwave, the old heater that barely worked during winter. The nights he smiled through exhaustion pretending everything was fine. And suddenly one painful realization settled deep into her chest. Her father stayed poor because he kept helping everybody else survive. Jonathan looked toward the gravestone again before speaking softly. Your father changed the direction of my entire life. Naomi lowered her eyes. Then why did he die struggling? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Sharp, honest, real. The billionaire did not seem offended. If anything, the words hit him harder than she expected. Jonathan exhaled slowly into the cold air. Because men like your father believe helping people matters more than keeping score. Naomi swallowed hard as silence returned again. Somewhere beyond the cemetery fence, distant traffic hummed through the city waking up for another ordinary morning. But nothing about this morning felt ordinary anymore. Jonathan motioned toward one of the men standing nearby. The older man stepped forward carrying a folded military jacket against his chest. His weathered hands shook slightly as he approached Naomi. "I served 2 tours overseas," he said quietly. "When I came home, I had nothing left." Naomi listened carefully while the man looked down at her father's grave with wet eyes. "Your dad found me sleeping behind his repair shop one winter. Fed me. Gave me work changing tires." The man smiled weakly through emotion. "That job kept me alive." Another man stepped forward next. Younger, tall, expensive suit. "I own 3 restaurants now," he said softly. "Your father loaned my mother $800 when our electricity got shut off." Naomi blinked in disbelief. $800. That was more money than her father ever seemed to have. The younger man lowered his head respectfully. "He told my mother dignity matters more than debt." Story after story filled the cemetery air. A woman whose nursing school tuition her father secretly paid. A truck driver whose family stayed together because her father fixed his engine for free. A recovering addict who said one conversation outside a gas station stopped him from giving up completely. Naomi's chest ached heavier with every voice. Her father never spoke about any of this. Not once. Jonathan finally stepped closer again, his expression calm but emotional beneath the falling mist. "Do you understand now?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at the crowd surrounding the grave. Successful people, broken people, survivors, strangers connected by one ordinary mechanic the world never noticed. Then Jonathan said something that made tears finally spill down Naomi's face. "Your father was the richest man I ever met. He just never kept the money for himself." 3 months later, Naomi Carter stood in front of a crowded ballroom overlooking San Francisco Bay while hundreds of guests rose to their feet applauding her father's name. The sound rolled across the glass walls like thunder, powerful and endless. But Naomi still felt like the same exhausted waitress who once counted quarters at the laundromat after overnight shifts. Only now, the world finally seemed to see what her father had seen in people all along. Golden lights reflected across crystal glasses and polished marble floors, while cameras flashed from every corner of the room. Politicians, business leaders, veterans, single mothers, former addicts, restaurant workers, men and women from completely different worlds filled the ballroom for one reason. A mechanic from Oakland who died believing nobody would remember him. Naomi stood behind the podium, wearing a simple navy dress Jonathan Hale's assistant helped her pick because she still did not know how rich people were supposed to dress at events like this. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked across the room toward the giant banner hanging above the stage. The Samuel Carter Foundation. Beneath the name was her father's favorite sentence written in silver letters. "Success means nothing if nobody rises with you." Naomi swallowed hard as emotion climbed into her throat again. In the front row sat Jonathan Hale beside the same men who once knelt at the grave. But tonight they were not mourning. They were witnessing something grow. Scholarships for struggling students. Emergency housing for veterans. Food assistance for working families. Small repair grants for people one paycheck away from losing everything. The foundation had already helped thousands in only a few months. Not because of billionaires alone. Because ordinary people across the country started donating after hearing her father's story. One act of kindness became another, then thousands more. Naomi looked toward the audience and spotted something that nearly broke her heart all over again. Near the back wall stood several employees from the diner where she used to work night shifts. Her old manager wiped tears from her face proudly, while one cook lifted his hand in support. Naomi smiled softly through watery eyes. She remembered carrying heavy coffee trays at 2 in the morning while strangers ignored her existence. Back then she thought survival was the biggest thing a person could accomplish. Now she understood something much bigger. Survival was only the beginning. Jonathan rose slowly from his seat and walked toward the stage carrying a small wooden box. The ballroom fell silent as he placed it gently in Naomi's hands. Inside rested her father's silver watch beside a brand new engraved plaque. Naomi read the inscription silently. "For the man who proved kindness outlives wealth." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she closed the box carefully against her chest. Outside the ballroom windows, the lights of San Francisco shimmered across the dark water like stars scattered over the earth itself. Naomi looked upward for a long moment, imagining her father somewhere beyond all of it, probably embarrassed by the attention, probably telling her not to make such a fuss. But deep down she knew the truth now. Some people leave behind buildings. Some leave behind money. Her father left behind people who became better because he existed. And in the end, that was the kind of wealth no grave could ever bury. The cemetery had grown quieter now, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt heavy, alive somehow. Naomi stood beside her father's grave while cold mist drifted through the rows of cracked headstones behind her. The cheap carnations in her hands were soaked from the damp morning air, their red petals trembling slightly in the wind, like they could feel the emotion surrounding the grave. Jonathan Hale remained standing nearby, holding the old silver watch carefully against his palm, while the men behind him waited in respectful silence. Nobody checked phones. Nobody rushed away. For the first time in years, Naomi felt like the world had stopped moving long enough to notice the kind of man her father really was. Jonathan glanced toward the distant highway barely visible beyond the cemetery fence. "There is something I never told anyone publicly," he said quietly. Naomi looked up slowly. The billionaire's expression tightened, as if the memory itself still carried weight after all these years. "The night your father saved me," Jonathan continued, "I was not a good man." The cold wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Jonathan lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "Back then I thought success meant winning at any cost. More money, more control, bigger deals. I treated people like obstacles instead of human beings." Naomi listened carefully while rainwater rolled slowly down the black umbrella resting beside the grave. Jonathan gave a faint, bitter smile. "Then I met your father on the worst night of my life." His voice softened now, quieter than before. "I remember lying there terrified after the crash. The storm was so loud I could barely hear myself think. And your father stayed beside me the entire time." Naomi could almost picture it now. Her father kneeling beside a stranger in the freezing rain while traffic roared through the darkness nearby. Jonathan looked directly at her. "Do you know what shocked me the most?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "He never once asked who I was." The words settled deep into the cold cemetery air. Jonathan swallowed hard before continuing. "He did not care about my bank account, my company, my status. To him, I was just another scared human being who needed help." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the gravestone as emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. That sounded exactly like her father. Jonathan reached into his coat again and removed a folded newspaper clipping protected inside clear plastic. The article headline read, "Young Tech Entrepreneur Survives Highway Crash." Naomi frowned slightly. Jonathan pointed toward the bottom corner of the article. Tiny print beneath the story read, "Unnamed local mechanic assisted emergency crews." No name, no photograph, nothing. Naomi felt something ache deep inside her. Her father saved a billionaire's life, and the world never even learned his name. Jonathan noticed the sadness crossing her face. "Your father preferred it that way," he said softly. "He told me recognition means nothing if your heart expects applause first." The billionaire stared down at the grave for another long moment before adding quietly, "That sentence changed my entire life." Naomi looked around at the men surrounding the headstone again. Veterans, business owners, fathers, survivors, people connected by one mechanic nobody important ever noticed while he was alive. And for the first time since her father died, Naomi stopped seeing the cemetery as a place where his story ended. She finally understood it was where his story had quietly been waiting to be discovered. Naomi stood silently beside her father's grave while the morning fog thickened around the cemetery, like a curtain hiding the rest of the world. The story she had just heard still echoed inside her chest louder than the wind moving through the trees above them. A mechanic who paid for medicine. A mechanic who bought work boots. A mechanic who kept strangers alive while his own family struggled to survive. None of it matched the man Naomi thought she knew. Her father never came home talking about heroes or miracles. He came home exhausted, grease on his hands, bills in his pockets, pain hidden behind tired smiles. Jonathan Hale watched her carefully as emotion moved across her face. Then the billionaire reached inside his coat and pulled out something unexpected. A folded diner receipt sealed carefully inside clear plastic. Naomi frowned slightly as Jonathan handed it to her. The paper looked ancient now, faded yellow around the edges. But the handwriting near the bottom hit her instantly. Samuel Carter. Her father's signature. Naomi's breath caught softly in her throat. "What is this?" she whispered. Jonathan's eyes drifted toward the grave again. The first meal your father ever bought me. Naomi looked down at the receipt more carefully. 2 coffees, 1 cheeseburger, 1 slice of apple pie. Total, $11.40. Date, October 18th, 1999. The morning after the highway accident. Jonathan gave a quiet laugh filled with sadness. I was sitting in a roadside diner after the hospital released me. My suit was ruined. My company was collapsing. I thought my life was over. Naomi listened closely while cold drizzle tapped softly against nearby umbrellas. Then your father walked in carrying a toolbox. Jonathan smiled faintly at the memory. He sat beside me like we had known each other for years. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the faded receipt while the billionaire continued. I offered him money again for saving my life. A lot of money. Jonathan shook his head slowly. Your father looked offended. Naomi almost smiled through the emotion tightening her chest. That sounded exactly like him. Jonathan leaned slightly closer now, his voice quieter. Do you know what he told me after he paid for my breakfast? Naomi shook her head slowly. Jonathan stared toward the cemetery horizon before answering. He said, the world already has enough people trying to become important. Try becoming useful instead. The sentence landed like thunder inside Naomi's chest, because she remembered hearing those exact words growing up. Her father used to say them while fixing broken engines late at night inside the tiny garage behind their apartment. Back then she thought they were just ordinary sayings from an ordinary man. But standing there now surrounded by people whose lives had changed because of him, Naomi finally understood their weight. Jonathan carefully removed another item from his coat pocket. A photograph. Naomi stared at it in silence. It showed her father sitting inside that old roadside diner laughing beside a much younger Jonathan Hale. Coffee cups between them. Rain still visible against the windows behind the booth. 2 completely different men connected by one impossible moment. That breakfast changed everything for me, Jonathan said softly. Not because your father saved my life on the highway. His voice tightened slightly. Because afterward he taught me what kind of man I should become if I survived it. Naomi kept staring at the faded diner receipt while cold rain drifted softly across the cemetery hill. $11.40. That was the price of the breakfast her father bought for a frightened young businessman 23 years ago. A cheeseburger, coffee, apple pie. Such a small thing. So ordinary. And somehow that tiny act had echoed across decades until it reached this moment beside a forgotten grave in Oakland. Jonathan Hale carefully slipped the old photograph back inside his coat before looking toward the men gathered nearby. Most people think changing the world requires power, he said quietly. Your father proved it only requires consistency. Naomi lowered her eyes as emotion tightened inside her chest again. She suddenly remembered all the times she had been embarrassed by her father growing up. The way he stopped to help strangers while they were already late. The way he gave away tools he could barely afford to replace. The way he treated homeless people with the same respect he gave doctors or business owners. Back then, Naomi thought kindness was the reason they stayed poor. Now she wondered if kindness was the reason her father became unforgettable. One of the men standing near the grave stepped forward, holding a folded newspaper under his arm. He looked to be in his late 60s, tall and lean with silver hair beneath a dark wool cap. I think she deserves to know the whole truth, he said softly toward Jonathan. Jonathan nodded once. The man unfolded the newspaper carefully and handed it to Naomi. Her eyes widened instantly. The front page showed Jonathan Hale years earlier standing in front of his first technology headquarters in San Francisco. Beneath the photograph, the headline read, Hale Industries launches National Community Investment Program. Naomi frowned slightly. What does this have to do with my father? The older man gave a faint emotional smile. Everything. He pointed toward a sentence buried deep in the article. Jonathan watched silently while Naomi read the words aloud under her breath. The company will dedicate 30% of annual profits toward direct support programs for struggling workers and low-income families. Naomi slowly looked up in confusion. Jonathan's expression softened. I made that policy because of your father. The wind swept through the cemetery again as Jonathan continued quietly. When I asked him why he kept helping people even when he had almost nothing himself, he told me something I never forgot. Naomi's fingers tightened around the newspaper. Jonathan's voice lowered. He said the people who suffer the most are usually the people nobody sees. The cemetery fell silent again. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes because suddenly everything connected. The scholarships, the shelters, the outreach programs, the veterans receiving housing assistance. Thousands of lives quietly changed through Jonathan Hale's companies over the years. Not because of public relations, not because of tax benefits, because one mechanic from Oakland planted a different way of thinking inside a billionaire's heart during a rainy breakfast in a roadside diner. Jonathan looked toward the gravestone one more time before speaking softly into the cold morning air. Your father did not just save my life that night. His eyes glistened now with emotion he no longer tried to hide. He saved the kind of man I could have become if nobody had stopped me. The entire ballroom went quiet the moment Victoria Langford lowered her champagne glass and looked directly at Naomi. Not with anger, not with arrogance, with recognition. The kind that makes powerful people suddenly forget how to breathe. Around them, crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables worth more than most families earned in a year, but none of that mattered anymore. Because the woman everyone thought was just a waitress had just exposed a flaw inside the billion-dollar acquisition contract that 20 lawyers had missed. Derek Caldwell felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers tightened around the edge of the leather chair as whispers spread across the rooftop dining room like wildfire. Naomi stood still beside the table, her black uniform perfectly pressed, her expression calm even as dozens of wealthy strangers stared at her for the first time all night. Earlier, they had looked through her. Now they looked at her like she carried a secret capable of destroying empires. Victoria slowly opened the contract again, her sharp blue eyes scanning the clause Naomi had translated from the original Japanese filing. A hidden liability, buried in legal language. Nearly $400 million in intellectual property exposure. One signature away from disaster. Trent tried to laugh it off first. Men like him always did. Come on, he muttered, forcing a grin. She is a waitress, not corporate counsel. But nobody laughed this time. Not even Derek. Because Victoria already knew the truth. Naomi had not guessed. She had understood every word, every technical phrase, every cultural nuance hidden between the lines. The older billionaire leaned back slowly, studying Naomi with growing fascination. Where did you learn Japanese legal translation? She asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for only a second. My father taught international contract law at Howard University before he passed away, she said. I used to help him translate documents after school. Silence followed again. Heavy silence. The kind that exposes every ugly assumption people made 5 minutes earlier. Derek suddenly remembered every joke, every dismissive glance, every moment he treated Naomi like background furniture instead of a human being. And for the first time that night, the billionaire CEO looked small. Victoria closed the contract carefully. You just saved this company from making the worst deal of my career, she said. Then she turned toward Derek. And you almost ignored her because she carried a tray instead of a briefcase. The words hit harder than any public humiliation ever could. Around the room, several investors quietly lowered their eyes. Because they were guilty too. They had all watched the disrespect happen. None of them stopped it. Naomi did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply adjusted the folded napkin over her arm and stepped back from the table. Grace looked different when you earned it the hard way. Derek finally stood from his chair, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. Naomi, I owe you an apology. She met his eyes calmly. No, sir, she replied softly. You owe people respect before you discover their value. And somehow, in a room filled with billionaires, that became the most expensive lesson of the night. The silence after Naomi spoke did not feel ordinary anymore. It felt expensive, dangerous. Like the entire rooftop restaurant had suddenly realized power did not always wear a custom suit. Outside the glass walls, the lights of San Francisco shimmered across the bay, but inside the private dining room, nobody cared about the skyline now. Every eye remained fixed on the young black waitress standing beside a billion-dollar negotiation table with more composure than half the executives in the room. Derek Caldwell loosened his tie slightly, the first visible crack in the armor he had worn all evening. For years, people feared him in boardrooms. Investors followed his instincts. Journalists called him ruthless but brilliant. Yet one calm sentence from Naomi had dismantled the illusion of control he built around himself. Victoria Langford slowly slid the contract folder shut. "This acquisition is suspended immediately," she announced firmly. The words landed like thunder. Trent nearly choked on his drink. "You cannot be serious," he snapped. "Because of one translation issue?" Victoria turned toward him sharply. "No," she replied. "Because your team almost pushed me into signing a fraudulent liability structure none of you bothered to fully understand." The older billionaire looked back toward Naomi again. "Accept her." Naomi shifted uncomfortably as attention tightened around her like heat. She never wanted the spotlight. People who spend their lives underestimated often learn how to survive quietly. But tonight, quiet was no longer possible. One of the junior investors near the far end of the table suddenly pulled out his phone. Then another. Within minutes, whispers moved through the room. Somebody had recorded the exchange. Derek noticed it instantly. He understood media cycles better than anyone. A story like this could spread across the internet before sunrise. Billionaire executives mocking a waitress who ultimately saved the deal from collapse. The optics alone were catastrophic. But strangely, that was no longer the part bothering him most. What haunted him was Naomi's voice. "You owe people respect before you discover their value." The sentence kept echoing in his head with brutal clarity. Because deep down, Derek knew she was right. He thought about every assistant he ignored. Every server he dismissed. Every employee he measured by status instead of humanity. Success had made him efficient. Wealth had made him careless. Naomi carefully picked up an empty crystal glass from the table, returning to work because that was what survival teaches people to do even after extraordinary moments. But before she could step away, Victoria stood. "Ms. Naomi Brooks," she said clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "I would like to formally offer you a position with Langford Global Consulting." Gasps rippled instantly across the dining room. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Victoria continued calmly. "Six-figure starting salary. International Contract Analysis Division. Full benefits." Derek looked stunned. Trent looked sick. But Victoria was not finished. "Talent should never have to beg to be seen," she added softly. Naomi looked down at the tray, still resting in her hands. Hours earlier, people at this table barely looked at her face. Now billionaires were fighting over her future. Funny how quickly the world changes when intelligence speaks louder than prejudice. For a moment, Naomi Brooks could not move. The noise of the rooftop restaurant faded into something distant and hollow, like waves crashing far below the glass tower. Six-figure salary. International consulting. A future nobody in this room imagined for her just hours earlier. Her fingers tightened gently around the silver tray in her hands, the same tray she had carried through years of double shifts, aching feet, and silent humiliation. Across the dining room, executives whispered behind raised wine glasses while camera phones continued recording. The story had already escaped the room. Derek Caldwell knew it. He glanced toward the glowing screens around him and saw his empire beginning to lose control of its own narrative in real time. But Naomi barely noticed any of it, because suddenly she was thinking about her father. Late nights at the kitchen table in their small apartment outside Oakland. Thick legal dictionaries stacked beside cold cups of coffee. Japanese textbooks filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Her father always told her one thing. Never let the world decide your intelligence by your uniform. At the time, she thought he meant school. She did not realize he meant life. Victoria Langford stepped closer, her voice gentler now. "You earned this, Naomi." The older billionaire extended a sleek black business card across the table. Naomi stared at it carefully, but did not take it immediately. That surprised everyone even more. Most people in that room would have fought for an opportunity like this. But Naomi understood something they did not. Dignity is not desperation. Derek watched her with quiet disbelief. For the first time in years, he saw someone unimpressed by money. "Why are you hesitating?" Trent finally asked, still sounding bitter beneath his forced smile. Naomi looked toward him calmly. "Because my value existed before tonight," she answered softly. Another silence spread across the rooftop. Heavy, honest, unavoidable. Some of the younger staff standing near the service entrance suddenly looked at Naomi differently now. Not with pity, with pride. Because every ignored worker in that building understood exactly what this moment meant. Naomi finally accepted the card from Victoria with steady hands. Not like someone being rescued. Like someone finally being recognized. Derek exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw as guilt settled deeper into his chest. I spent this entire evening thinking I was the smartest person in the room, he admitted quietly. Naomi met his eyes one final time. That was the problem, she replied. No cruelty, no revenge, just truth. And somehow that hurt more. Outside, fog drifted slowly across the San Francisco skyline, while helicopters blinked in the distance above the bay. Inside the rooftop restaurant, nobody returned to normal conversation. Because some nights change more than business deals. Some nights expose the difference between power and character. Naomi picked up her apron carefully, folded it over her arm, and walked toward the elevator with calm, graceful steps. Nobody stopped her this time. Nobody ignored her either. And as the elevator doors slowly closed, Derek Caldwell realized something that would haunt him long after the headlines disappeared. The most important person in the room had never been the billionaire at the table. It had been the waitress everyone underestimated.